When COVID-19 struck in early 2020, Formula One was caught in uncharted waters. Races were cancelled, revenues collapsed, and teams faced the risk of financial ruin. The sport, often known for its excess, suddenly had to confront survival. Zak Brown, CEO of McLaren Racing, saw the crisis as both a threat and an opportunity. With sponsors pulling out and manufacturers cutting back, the pandemic exposed the fragility of the F1 model. Brown recognized that the long-debated issue of spiraling costs could no longer be ignored. What had once been resisted by wealthier teams was now an urgent necessity for everyone. Against this backdrop, he began shaping his argument for a budget cap, not as a matter of competitive fairness, but as the only way to secure the future of Formula One. His timing was critical. In the middle of uncertainty, Brown positioned himself as a voice of reason and pragmatism, advocating for reform when the sport's very survival depended on it. The financial realities of McLaren sharpened Brown's focus. Unlike manufacturer-backed giants such as Mercedes and Ferrari, McLaren was an independent team reliant on sponsorship and prize money. COVID's disruption hit them particularly hard. McLaren had to furlough staff, cut costs, and even seek external investment to stay afloat. Brown knew the pandemic made survival precarious, not just for his team but also for smaller outfits like Williams and Haas. Without systemic reform, the grid risked shrinking further, undermining the sport's credibility. McLaren's vulnerability gave Brown authenticity. He wasn't speaking in theory; his team's very future was at stake. By championing a stricter cost cap, he positioned McLaren not as a victim, but as a driver of change. His message resonated beyond his own organization. For the first time, there was a sense that Formula One could not simply return to business as usual. Brown's push transformed into a wider movement to rethink how money dictated success in the sport. Before the pandemic, the budget cap debate was locked in stalemate. Big teams resisted limits, fearing they would lose competitive advantages built on vast resources. Smaller teams argued for fairness, but lacked the influence to force change. COVID shifted the balance. With revenue streams collapsing, even the most powerful teams faced painful financial strain. Suddenly, the argument was no longer about fairness; it was about survival. Brown's lobbying took center stage. He framed the budget cap as a lifeline that could keep 10 teams on the grid, ensuring the sport's future. The FIA and Formula One's commercial rights holders found in him an ally willing to articulate tough truths. As the crisis deepened, the momentum shifted. What had been a theoretical reform became an urgent necessity. The cap was approved, set initially at $145 million per season, with gradual reductions in following years. Brown's advocacy had helped transform a controversial idea into binding regulation. Even as the budget cap gained traction, divisions remained. Teams like Ferrari and Red Bull, with strong manufacturer or national backing, argued for exceptions. They cited historical status, technical complexities, or the costs of maintaining large infrastructures. Zak Brown countered these claims with sharp clarity. He argued that without uniform enforcement, the cap would collapse into loopholes. His position found allies among independent teams and those struggling to remain viable. The pandemic exposed a fundamental divide. On one side, the traditional powerhouses defending their privileges; on the other, the rest of the grid fighting for equal footing. Brown's American business sensibility, rooted in transparency, accountability, and sustainability, gave him credibility. He reframed the debate as one of modernizing the sport, rather than clinging to outdated hierarchies. By emphasizing survival and long-term growth, Brown challenged the Austrian influence of Red Bull and the Italian legacy of Ferrari, pushing the sport toward a fairer, more sustainable model. Brown's push for the budget cap wasn't just about numbers; it was about trust and persuasion. He spoke openly about McLaren's financial challenges, humanizing what many saw as a purely corporate issue. His candidness resonated across the paddock. Smaller teams saw him as a leader willing to fight their corner. Even some rival executives acknowledged his ability to frame the argument beyond self-interest. By positioning cost controls as a matter of protecting jobs and sustaining competition, Brown connected with the human side of the crisis. This approach helped blunt opposition from larger teams. They could argue about competitiveness, but they could not dismiss the reality of job losses or team closures. Brown's success was in shifting the moral high ground. Instead of being seen as lobbying for McLaren alone, he became the voice of the sport's broader survival. In a paddock often divided by politics, his leadership was both rare and effective. The FIA and Liberty Media faced unprecedented pressure during the pandemic. With races canceled and financial uncertainty looming, they needed a plan to reassure teams, fans, and sponsors. Zac Brown's advocacy provided that clarity. His calls for a cap aligned with Liberty's desire for a more competitive product and FIA's role as regulator. The crisis created an opening for decisive action. The leadership of Jean Todt at the FIA and Chase Carey at Liberty Media leaned on Brown's arguments to frame their decisions. By presenting the cap as both a financial necessity and a sporting equalizer, they secured broader support. The timing was crucial. Without the disruption of COVID, entrenched resistance from larger teams might have stalled reform. Instead, Brown's campy Eigen aligned with governing bodies, eager to show leadership in crisis. The budget cap became not just McLaren's lifeline, but a defining reform for the entire sport. Shaping Formula One's future, passing the budget cap was only the beginning. Implementing it presented a new wave of challenges. Larger teams had to downsize operations, lay off staff, and restructure technical departments. Questions emerged about accounting transparency and enforcement. Zac Brown understood that without credible oversight, the cap risked becoming symbolic rather than transformative. He pushed for strict auditing systems and independent reviews, emphasizing that accountability was essential to protect the integrity of the sport. Resistance continued, with some teams lobbying for exemptions or creative interpretations of allowable expenses. Brown remained vocal, warning that weak enforcement would undermine the entire reform. His stance again positioned McLaren as a guardian of fairness rather than an opportunist. In the months that followed, the FIA strengthened auditing processes, setting precedents for penalties against breaches. The cap was no longer just a headline. It became a genuine framework for reshaping the economics of Formula One. The early effects of the budget cap were visible. Gaps between the front and midfield began to narrow, with smaller teams gaining more opportunities to fight for points. While the richest outfits still held advantages in infrastructure and historic success, the reforms prevented unchecked spending from deciding outcomes entirely. Zac Brown's vision of a more competitive grid slowly came into focus. McLaren, despite its financial challenges, began rebuilding with renewed confidence. Other independents also saw hope of climbing the standings. For fans, the promise of closer racing brought fresh excitement. Though the top three teams still dominated, the sense that underdogs could challenge more often began to grow. Brown's insistence that sustainability and fairness were key proved prophetic. Formula One was not only surviving the pandemic but emerging stronger. The reforms were reshaping the competitive landscape, showing how a moment of global crisis had forced long-needed change onto the sport. Zac Brown's bargaining during COVID became one of the defining chapters in Formula One's modern history. He turned a moment of weakness into strategic leverage. By aligning McLaren's survival with the sport's broader interests, he transformed himself from a team executive into a reformer. His insistence on fairness reshaped how financial power influenced outcomes. While larger teams still carried weight, the balance had shifted. For the first time, cost regulation created a shared framework binding everyone. Brown's role was not just about saving McLaren, but about preserving Formula One's identity as a competition rather than a spending race. His legacy extended beyond the numbers. He showed that leadership in crisis meant more than protecting self-interest. It meant reshaping the system for collective survival. In doing so, Brown carved a place for himself not only in McLaren's Tory but in the broader narrative of Formula One's transformation during turbulent times. The pandemic will be remembered as a turning point in Formula One, and Zak Brown's role in securing the budget cap remains central to that story. What began as an existential crisis ended with a reform that redefined the sport's structure. Brown's foresight ensured that independent teams had a future, while fans gained a more competitive spectacle. The cap, once resisted as impossible, became the cornerstone of a new era. Though challenges remain in enforcement and adaptation, the principle is now embedded. Formula One is no longer a contest of limitless spending, but one where strategy, talent, and efficiency hold greater weight. The pandemic exposed vulnerabilities, but it also created the conditions for necessary evolution. Brown's actions illustrated how leadership, when aligned with both principle and timing, can shape history. The sport that emerged from COVID is not the same one that entered it, and that change carries his unmistakable imprint.